Oh, definitely worth mentioning this one comment I just happened to see here that people that I think Radhika, if I said it correctly, um, she just wanted to share that she's so excited to see these speakers. And I think that's wonderful. And I echo that excitement. I am also very excited. So I will say, with that excitement, let's get started. So thank you everybody for joining. We have a really, I tried not to say rock star folks because, it gets overused, but I feel like I have some rock stars in front of me right now in terms of, let's get this conversation going. We have Advita Patel, Jason Anthoine, Kristin Hancock, Katie Macaulay, and Priya Bates. This is amazing. And we're going to introduce everybody real quick and then jump into this. Just a little bit of like background of why we're doing this. So earlier this year, a few months ago, I'm not sure if you're familiar or aware, but the world kind of changed as we knew it. And so during that brief period of time, Staffbase itself experienced this exponential growth in news that was being published, in readership, and over the weekends and during the weeks that were passing by. And this is just within our customer base. And then of course, if you jump onto, if you were, anywhere on any type of social platform, wow, like people were just kind of freaking out, quite frankly. And they were seeking information. I think it was actually Edelman that ran a report on the effects of COVID-19 and where people were going to try to find information. And the number one place that they were going to was their company, where they work. And so really quickly, before we dive into the conversation, this is why it's important to Staffbase. We understand that, numbers, being able to find a way to make your communications measurable is paramount. And leaders love numbers, and we help you provide them. And if you have a channel that's easy to use, easy to administer, and easy to share, something I love saying is that sending isn't receiving. When you actually have an opportunity to work on both different paths and have one single place for all that information that's so important, it's really relevant to you. But in order to make it completely work for you, you need to have the right mindset, the right frame of mind in order to do that. So we're going to start right off with a poll, and then I want to introduce our folks. So first, let's do the poll. Don't be alarmed if you're on your screen. The poll will launch and everything will just disappear, and then the poll pop up, and then we'll be able to get this started. Okay. So give everybody about 30 seconds to fill this out. I wish it actually casted the live numbers and percentages going up, because it's so remarkable to see all the different numbers. Okay, I'm going to give it about 5 more seconds to see what happens. And yep, there we go. Let's share the results. And wow, very, very interesting. So based on your own situation, how do you feel? It looks like most people either feel self-aware or they need more time. And I think that's really interesting. Why don't we start this off? I want to introduce our incredible panel here. Jason, why don't you introduce yourself? I'm looking at all the bubbles in the order as it goes from here to here. So Jason, why don't you introduce yourself?
The perils of going alphabetically, right? I always have to go first. Spelling test, everything else stinks. So Jason Anthoine, I run a consulting firm called Audacity. We do internal comms, employee engagement, and culture change. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm excited to be here with all of these fantastic professionals and look forward to the conversation and sharing my own struggles and wins over imposter syndrome, and looking forward to hearing what everybody else has to say as well.
Wonderful. Advita, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, my name is Advita. Obviously, I live in the UK, in Manchester. I own my own internal communications and employee experience consultancy called Comms Rebel. I also sit on the board of directors with the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, and I'm also the committee chair for the internal communications arm of that. So I'm looking forward to today. It's going to be really exciting. I can't wait to get going.
Yes, and Kristin.
Hello, I'm Kristin Hancock. I am a Canadian recent immigrant to America, which is a fascinating place to be right now. I am a consultant in the internal comm space and workplace culture. And as soon as America gets me that green card, I'm going to be doing that again down here. So looking forward to today's conversation with a really awesome group of people.
Excellent. Katie.
Thank you, Jason. And I'm so glad that this has been so popular and interesting. I can't wait to get into this conversation. So my name is Katie Macaulay. I'm Managing Director of AUB, the Internal Comms Agency based in London. I'm based here in the south of England at the moment. I'm host of the Internal Comms podcast and the author of a book called From Cascade to Conversation. So yeah, that's me.
And last but not least, Priya.
Hello, I'm Priya Bates, and I'm here from sunny Toronto, Canada. I'm kind of enjoying this ethereal look I've got going on. I manage an internal communication agency based in Toronto, Canada called Inner Strength Communication, and we focus on employee engagement, internal communication, and change management. And one of the things I've often talked about lately is that our challenges are not about capability and capacity, but more about confidence and courage. And I hope this conversation really helps us move the needle on that.
Wonderful. And so let's get this conversation started. I happen to find this quote. I am admittingly a huge Stephen Covey fan. The 7 Habits is a book that I read probably at least once or twice a year. And this one quote really grabbed me to kind of start off by asking, what is the imposter syndrome? And I think for all of you that are joining, we've had some great tidbits or snippets on social media talking about their different impersonations of it. I would like to start with Advita, and because actually this whole session, this whole experience that we're having right now is because of her. We were having a sidebar conversation. I was learning about Advita and all her incredible success, and we started talking about the imposter syndrome. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I want to see some faces. I miss being in front of people. So let's just see the people here, and we'll jump right in here.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jason. Yes, this all did start off with a side conversation, so it's just amazing how many people we've got joining us today. Imposter syndrome is something that I have battled with for most of my career. And it's something that it's never been something that I can put my finger on and where it started from and why I have it. And we're having a conversation just before everybody joined about it's something I think a lot of people do experience it, but may not openly admit that they experience it. And the reason we were chatting, Jason, was because due to some of the conversations I've had over the past few months that's been going on in the world with the global pandemic, a lot of internal communicators have found themselves thrusted into the limelight with their senior executives and leadership team, and many of those people, not for the want of trying, have never really had that time with the CEO. And I've been in internal communications for around about 15 years, and the topic of conversation in many conferences I've been part of is how do I get that seat at that table? How do I have that conversation? I'm not being taken seriously enough. And I think a lot of people on this call, and I know definitely the people I've spoken to in the past, suddenly in the last few months have been recognised for their skills and the work that they do in the organisation. Which has led to many people experiencing a bout of imposter syndrome and this whole, oh my God, I'm winging it and I feel like a fraud, and am I good enough to have this conversation with this senior leader, and is it just not better for me to stay under the radar now because all of a sudden I've been asked for my opinion and does my opinion matter? And it's something I resonate with quite a lot, and it's something that I've also had to deal with in my career when I've been stood in front of boardrooms and in front of chief executives to explain, why we've chosen to go down a certain path and face into those courageous conversations. So it's definitely something I've experienced and still experience myself. It's something that others have experienced. It'll be fascinating to hear from others in terms of how they are managing it, in terms of their own imposter and what the kind of benefits and what the solutions are to try and fix their imposter and how they kind of manage everyday situations. So yeah, that's how it all kind of kicked off.
Advita, I think you bring up a really interesting point, because for years going to internal comms conferences, I felt like we were all broken records, because all I would hear is that everybody needs a seat at the table. How do I get a seat at the table? I don't have a seat at the table, this magical table. And now we have seats at the table and we're like, I'm not qualified to do this. So there's this kind of, I don't want to make light of people's emotions, but it's this really funny juxtaposition, I guess, of those two feelings, both of which are valid, but finding that balance between the two, and channeling both of those feelings to move things forward and learn from them.
And I like the analogy that that Jason brought up at the beginning of this, and it really is about a change in you. I think that you know, one of my frustrations has been hearing about the complaining and the whining about the lack of respect, but the not wanting to do anything about it. And I think that that there's nothing wrong with being exactly where you are, as long as you can accept where you are and what you do. But if you do want to move forward, if you do want to complain about making a difference, then you need to step in the right direction and actually change your behavior.
Katie, you did some really interesting research on this. I would love to get your thoughts on exactly what Priya was just touching on, which is that owning your seat, and you know, maybe there's something along the lines of self-doubt in what you've uncovered.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting what imposter syndrome sometimes looks like, because when you brought this up, I wondered to myself, I definitely had it early in my career. Do I have it now? And then I thought, oh, I'm being one of these panelists on this eminent group of people talking about imposter syndrome. What do I know about it? And so I had to spend hours of research going back to the original paper that the two female psychologists came up with in 1978, reading that and subsequent work, learning about the opposite of imposter syndrome, which is really interesting, gathering all those thoughts together, writing a blog for LinkedIn. And then I thought, okay, yes, I might now just be able to make a contribution to this panel. And I realized as I was doing that, that is an example of imposter syndrome.
I love that.
Yeah.
What we syndrome is we look at our success, and imposter syndrome, all the research suggests that it's mainly successful people that suffer from it. But what we do as successful people is we discount our success. We think, oh, we got that by fluke or just by working hard. We're not naturally brilliant. We never wing it. We never shoot from the hip. We always do our research, we always do all that background prep so that we turn up as our very best selves, because we're worried, we're fearful that the mask is going to be ripped off and everyone's going to discover that we're a bit of a phony after all. So I suppose my first message is that is to a degree, you have to kind of, it's a bit like fear, isn't it? You have to acknowledge you're feeling it and welcome it and say, oh, hello, imposter syndrome. I thought you might turn up for this because I've been thrust. Now my chief executive has me on speed dial and wants to speak to the world, is coming through me to get to, you know, all our people. I expected you to turn up. I'm going to welcome you, but I'm not going to make that the reason why I don't step up. So somehow I'm going to incorporate this feeling of imposter syndrome into my life. And I think that managing it and also realizing that so many other people feel it too. And I bet all across this panel, we've all felt it at some point, I would say.
There was one thing that we were all talking about in one of our earlier discussions, and maybe Jason, you can touch on this too, is a lot of folks that I think are in today's session are experiencing something a little unique. A good portion of your careers, maybe you've been sort of anxious to have an opportunity to really be working side by side with the leadership of your organization. And now, given the certain circumstance, not only are you working with that person, but you're also getting text messages and emails and phone calls and video conferences, and you're feeling something a little different than maybe what you expected. Jason, I didn't know if you had some thoughts on that.
No, that's exactly right. And, you know, Kristin talked earlier about how we've always been pining away to get that seat at the table. And, you know, down here in south of the United States, we have a saying about the dog that chases the car down the street. You know, what is going to happen when that dog actually catches that car? And I think we all feel like that right now. We have been chasing that car down the street for years, and now we have finally caught that car. And what in the hell are we going to do with this car? And I think we all feel that right now. There would be times when we were working in our offices and we would pass the CEO in the hall, and the CEO may not even know who we are. And now we're getting text messages and video calls and all kinds of stuff. And so we went from being sort of, anonymous to being totally key to what's going to happen for the future of our organizations. That is both exciting and scary at the same time. And I think it causes us all to question not only our abilities, but our capabilities, and whether or not, we're truly prepared to be doing this. The reality is we've been doing it forever, kind of in the shadows. But now we're under the spotlight. That's a time for us to shine. Doesn't mean we aren't shy about it. Doesn't mean it's not scary. All these feelings are valid, but it's an opportunity for us to finally do what in our hearts and our minds we've been doing forever.
And that's
Katie's
the fear
point.
and the sorry.
No, go ahead, Priya.
I was just saying that's the fear and the opportunity, right? All at the same time. It's us seeing this opportunity in front of us and a time for us to embrace it, and the fear that we're going to step backwards because we're afraid to. And I think that's why we're all here as consultants who really are passionate about internal communication and the power it has to enable organizations to make sure this is a launch pad for success, not something that we step back on the ladder versus moving forward.
And to Katie's point, I love the idea of recognizing when that feeling comes into being. And this is true in all facets of life, not just our professional lives, that recognizing some of those feelings when they happen is that first step of welcoming it in. Oh, this is okay. I'm questioning myself. I'm doubting myself. Mm-hmm. And turning that into oh, that must mean I'm onto something really good. Because as Katie mentioned, it's successful people feel that. The article I was reading earlier talked about the stats of estimating 80% of people, all genders, feel this. So really, it's not, maybe we should stop labeling people with imposter syndrome and calling the other 20% overconfident weirdos. And so recognizing that when you have those doubts, flipping that into like, oh, okay, here we go. I'm onto something really good.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to how we frame in our own minds success and failure. So the one thing about failure is that it isn't always the opposite of success. Sometimes it can be one step closer to success. You've tried something out, it didn't quite work, but by trying it out, the next thing you try might be closer to success. So, my message here to everyone would be your comfort zone is not really your friend. It's safe, it's warm, it's a lovely place to be, and I like my comfort zone, I really do, but it's not your friend. And I've spent nearly 30, well, I have actually, be honest, Katie, I've spent 30 years in internal comms, but I absolutely know I wouldn't be as energized and as fused and as excited about it if that had been 1 year repeated 30 times. And that's what you do not want in your career. And this is an opportunity to have an unrepeatable year, to have an experience you haven't had before. But as I say, that does require you to step out slightly of your comfort zone, I'd say.
And I think it's also understanding what your triggers are. Like Kristin said, it's about knowing, actually, what is this? What's happening to me here? Am I, what are my triggers? What's causing me to have this uncertainty about myself? And that's really, and spot on with what Kristin was saying about embracing this imposter. And I treat my imposter as a part of who I am. And I actually, the people agree with it or disagree with it, but I actually name mine. And I have, call me a weirdo, but I have conversations with her on a regular basis. And her name's Sandy, and she sometimes she goes off on long haul holidays and leaves me alone, and other days she's back to visit like an unwanted guest. And that for me has really helped me understand myself, because this imposter is me, it's part of me. It's like similar to an alter ego, and as I don't want to call her me, like version 2 Advita. It's a different person because she's trying to stop me progressing, and she's trying to stop me putting my head above the parapet and take that step forward. And there are certain things I know, similar to what Katie did, is credibility is one of my strongest values, and I spend hours and hours and days and money in investing in certificates and qualifications and training just to prove that I am worthy to have that conversation with people like these guys on the call and to sit at a board table and add value, because I know if I didn't do that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with this, but if I didn't do that, my imposter would be rife and it would tell me I'm not going to be there. So I know my trigger is education and CPD. So I would spend energy and time educating myself a little bit more and doing some CPD just so I feel comfortable. And then Sandy leaves me the hell alone, to be honest, because I can prove that I am here to do that. And for other people, it may be different things. Some people like running and some people like doing yoga and doing that mindfulness stuff. But I just think you shouldn't punish yourself or feel guilty for doing something that makes your imposter feel better. And I think that's, it's part of who you are. And I think as soon as we all learn to accept that, like Kristin said, we'll feel much better about ourselves mentally and physically and who we are professionally and personally. So I think that's important to remember, not to punish who we are and embrace all parts of ourselves.
Can everyone who is on this call promise to name their imposter, please? Because that's what I'm doing today. So everyone at Huffington calls that imposter her obnoxious roommate and talks about evicting. This is what you're saying. It's like evicting this obnoxious roommate in your head. And now I need to have a name for my obnoxious roommate imposter.
That's it. Okay, Taylor, I know you're listening. Hashtag name your imposter. Let's do it. 10 people out there. Let's see who your imposter name is. Really
tweet
quick.
it.
Yes, absolutely. Please tweet it. And so Advita, you brought up a really interesting point that I think directly relates to one of the questions and I kind of want to get Priya's response to this. Because the question, you talked about that fear of, Sandy trying to prevent you from being, capable of being at the table. But on the flip side, there's a lot of folks that very rightly feel that communicators aren't valued. They aren't valued. They don't want to have the communicators at that table. Why is that? And how do you overcome it? Priya, I'd love your thoughts.
Well, I think, it starts with belief in yourself and your value. I think that we've got incredible examples. I'm sure everyone on this call has incredible examples of when they contributed and made the difference for an organization's success or failure, right? Mostly success, right? They made the difference, because if they weren't there and people didn't understand, they weren't aware, they didn't respond, they didn't believe, they wouldn't have moved the organization forward. So understand what you've done. And I keep that, a record of that information. But also, in this case, take the time to debrief, make recommendations, provide your point of view, because people are listening. Take the opportunity to share your perspective, because you'll be amazed how much you've got to contribute, but also that you never taken the time to have that conversation. So it's really about having the courage to have the conversation today, and nobody's going to take 100%, right? We're all consultants. We've consulted with our executives and our clients. They never take every single thing we've said and gone with it. But if they take 10%, if they take one thing, that makes such a big difference. Consider that a win. Don't create a scorecard that says they took 1 out of 10. Say they took one thing that we moved forward on, and that's exciting.
And also, unfortunately, you don't always get to hear, well done, thank you so much. Leaders, in my experience anyway, no news has been good news. The fact that they just come back and they ask you again. So sometimes you have to have that reserve yourself to know I did a good job, because you're not always going to get that validation externally. It's probably why your network and maybe having a mentor is quite useful, so you can step out of the work environment and get that validation and confirmation from elsewhere. Interestingly, the psychologists around imposter syndrome suggest that it's helpful to have a mentor who is not exactly like you. So someone you fiercely admire, who doesn't give praise very easily, and then when you get praise from them, you really know you've earned it, is apparently quite useful. So that might be one suggestion to make as well.
Kristin, earlier in our conversation, we were talking about you had a little bit of some suspicion around this thing called imposter syndrome. And I think now is a really good time to talk about that suspicion that you might have.
I'm gonna ruffle some feathers on this call here. I'm a little jacked up. So I think I'll start by saying that however you feel is valid, always, always, always. And so recognizing what that feeling is and also giving it language is really important. We've talked about that already, about recognizing that imposter syndrome and when that starts to creep in. I think that some of the conversation I hear that is about imposter syndrome being a term that we use to just accept that we aren't good enough or that we aren't at this mythical table. And I think that for me is problematic, because I want us to advance past that and recognize that if you have that self-doubt, that's completely valid, and it's important to recognize that. And as Katie mentioned, it might mean that you are onto something great and that you are being successful right now, but that it's not an excuse to just stop and use that. Well, I don't know if I belong here. I have imposter syndrome, so I guess I just shouldn't keep going, or I shouldn't keep trying. No. If you have that, you're onto something great, so keep going. There's a quote, I think it's a Brene Brown quote. Either way, it's not my quote, but that I remind myself of, that if you're looking for places you don't belong, you will always find them. And I think that ties into a lot of this, that if you are looking for reasons to doubt yourself, if you are looking for places where you don't belong, that's what you'll find.
I'm going to just
Please
build on that, actually, because I think, and this is a difficult one to lay on the line for everyone that's listening, but there's a diversity issue here, and I'm not. This is not my idea. In researching this, I came across a wonderful speech. In fact, it is in the blog. I put a link to it, from Michelle Obama. But she talks about, we have these kind of stereotypes of what looks like a competent person, right, around the boardroom table. And the people that look like a competent person is just the stereotypes of those normal people that we're used to seeing, and they might not look like us, and that's when we start to doubt ourselves. But the trouble is, if everyone around the table looks and feels and thinks and talks like each other, you've got awful groupthink. And we can all think of terrible corporate disasters that have happened because of that. So I hate to lay this on the line for people, but you almost have, I think, somewhat of a duty, if you can step up, to stop that groupthink. If you are different from everyone else, it is a good thing. And that is a good reason. Just because you feel different might be a great reason to speak up, actually.
And Katie, to that point, I think even more important is for those of us who do look like everyone around the table, it's important for us to bring in the people who don't look like everyone else around the table. So if you're looking around the table and everyone looks like you, then it is also your responsibility, even more so, to bring in different voices, different everything.
And I love that, I deliver conferences, and what was really surprising to me when I started my conferences here in Canada was I was committed to making sure my speaking panels were diverse. And so I went out and created some guidelines and decided this is what I'm looking for, and then sent out a call for speakers. And when I looked at the call for speakers, the people who stepped up were the same people. And I had to actually go and tap people on the shoulder. So I appreciate that you guys said that when you're looking around and you don't see people looking like you tend to shrink back and say, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough to step forward. And sometimes just take the chance to step forward, because some of us, Advita and I, some of the women who've come up, in general, like people who are different, have stepped up and said, I'm going to be first, or I'm going to be included, so that everybody who's coming behind us has somebody to see and somebody who they can relate to.
And that is something that is so important to me. And it's, these kind of things, is doing these webinars and speaking on panels and standing on stage is uncomfortable, and you've got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I know, I always preach the, be the change you want to see. And what Kristin and Katie, quite said about having that diverse view is so important to me. And I grew up in my career not seeing anyone that looked like to me around that board table, or even within the industry that I have a career in. There wasn't any woman of colour, there wasn't an ethnic, especially I live in Manchester, which is outside of London, and there wasn't many people I could relate to. So when I did get those opportunities to speak at the board table, it did, the imposter syndrome flared massively, thinking, what on earth have I done to deserve to be here? And surely what I'm saying is going to be, I'm going to get found out soon. And I, again, what Priya and Kristin, Katie have said, it's a plea to anyone that you need to step out of line. And Michelle Obama says this quite a lot in her book, Becoming, that in order to see the change you want to see and be the future that you want to see, you do need to step up and step out and get comfortable with being uncomfortable, but find the things that you can handle and get the, like I said, find your triggers and find the things that will support you to do that.
Katie, I thought you made a fantastic point about the perils of that table. Once you are invited to that table, you are now one of them, and that makes you less valuable as a communicator. So you want to be invited to that table, but you are more valuable to the organization when you are not necessarily a part of that table, because you can step away and look at things objectively and provide counsel and advice in a way that you would never be able to do once you become one of them. And so even if you are at that table all the time, you still have to retain the ability to be able to step away from that and provide that type of counsel. Otherwise, you're just like everyone else that's sitting around there, and you're not going to be as open to sharing what you think or hearing what others who aren't at that table have to say.
So while this discussion's happening, I just wanted to issue the next poll, which is, do you feel valued as a communicator? And Katie, I know you were just about to talk, so I'd love to hear your thoughts while we're going through this poll.
I was just going to build on that point, actually. It's never in the job description, is it? But we do sometimes act as, I don't want to call it, I guess it is the conscience of our organisation.
Amen. Amen. That's exactly right.
Someone has to be.
So
this is it's interesting to compare, though, when you're talking about where you are within the organization. I am going to be 0% politically here, but I'm going to use politics as an example. There are different roles within the political system that allow you to do different things. And so when we talk about, should so-and-so be president or vice president or prime minister or whatever, sometimes there are people who say, yeah, you know what, I can get more done as a premier, as a governor, or whoever. And so maybe that's a little bit like this.
Yeah. I have a friend of mine who's advanced his career in the aerospace industry. He started out as an intern working in the manufacturing area, and is now, the comptroller for a very large manufacturing site. And every time they want to give him promotion, they want to add a bunch of people to him so that he can, be a manager and have a big team and stuff. And every single time he says, nope, I don't want to do any of that. I am more valuable to this organization if I continue focusing on the things that I am really, 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 really good at, and just that. And he said no every single time. And despite that, he keeps getting promoted and keeps having career growth, because he's identified where he can provide the best value and where everything else can be someone else's responsibility.
I think one thing too that I'm just trying to consolidate all these incredible thoughts about, that really understanding, own the seat or don't. It seems like you need to be not just transparent with the folks that you're working with, but transparent with yourself. It also there's a lot about this, looking at the results, like 38% of the voters were kind of like meh in the middle. And I see that kind of really revealing in terms of an uncertainty. And that sounds similar to what Katie was talking about earlier, about this self-doubt and how that actually, getting outside of the comfort zone is an okay thing. And I'd love to get more thoughts around, okay, so acknowledging this self-doubt. What about planning? What can I do to get myself, acknowledge where I'm at, but then also make sure that I'm armed with at least the right information to make myself as productive as possible?
I mean, for me, it's one of the things I've always felt very, very strongly about in terms of our role inside organisations, is that it is an incredibly privileged position. You know, we can go and ask questions of anyone, anywhere, and get amazing insight. And I think what's happened at the moment through this pandemic is we've been in broadcast mode a lot of the time, and that's totally understandable. We've got to keep people safe, and we've got to keep people well. But one of the things we could do now to really arm ourselves with the equipment, with the insight, with the knowledge, is to get a real sense of where everyone's at, what they need next, what the return to work, the slow return to work might look like, and how people are feeling about that, and the emotional and the physical support they might need. Having that information, and you can get it for free, because you know you don't have to. It's harder to get that research from customers and clients, but you know you should be able to get that from your own organisation yourself. Bringing that to the table will make you invaluable. People, in my experience at the moment of leaders, they want to hear this stuff. They realise that the front line is a lifeline a lot of the time, and has been for the last few weeks, and they want to serve their front line. And if you have a way into that, and you understand what they're thinking and feeling, then you're highly valuable to them.
And it's about leading into those difficult conversations as well. So you may have this toolkit of information, and I'm a big fan of data and insights, and that is something that helps my imposter if I know I've got the data, rather than just relying on my gut to support that. But it's about leaning in on those difficult conversations and having the confidence to have those courageous chats. And what I always say to anyone that I kind of coach or mentor or speak to is, remember that everyone is either maybe senior to you, and they may have a fancy job title or whatever may be going on in that organisation, but you're all equals and you're all human beings, and you are there as a professional in the career that you've chosen, and it's likely that they probably couldn't do your job as much as you may not be able to do there. So it's that equal respect, and I think as soon as you turn it around and say we're all equal on this, and you know we're going to speak to each other with a bit of respect, I think that can boost your confidence a bit, because you are sharing the knowledge that you've gained, like Katie said, about what's going on around. And as communicators, and I say this all the time, our job is to advise and guide, and if they choose to take that on board, that is, you know, great. If they choose not to take your advice and guidance on board, then that's something that we have to learn to accept. If we've done everything in our power to support them and give them all the evidence, then that is something that we just have to accept and think, right, well, I've done my best and I've done what I can in the role that I can play in this situation. So here's what I can do. And I think as comms, we can put too much pressure on ourselves to do that convincing and not worrying and not sleeping at night. So just bear that in mind when you next have that conversation with your senior team.
Whenever I present, I show an image of a waiter taking an order at a table, and really thinking about whether you want to be the person who's taking orders, being the waiter, or do you actually want to be sitting at the table having the conversation and making the decisions. And I think too much when you're feeling like you're not valued, it's because what you're doing is simply taking the orders and coming back and delivering them, versus actually asking the questions like Katie said, and having the conversation, you know, that will, and contributing your input and your opinions. And that that little tweak about, I'm not going to be the waiter, I'm not going to be the order taker, I'm actually going to contribute to this conversation, because we're all going to benefit from that contribution.
I have to jump in real quick, because there's a really interesting conversation happening in the chat, and I want to insert it into this because I think it's very relevant. So the comments between, and thank you, Colleen and Lynette, I just happened to glance over the questions. The discussion is that people were actually giving themselves a 3 out of 5 because they actually do feel valued. But the problem is that there's agreement between leadership and comms, or leadership in HR, or leadership in employee experience, but there's no follow through.
My question to that then is, what is your internal process for follow through? What is the structure of your project management or decision making that at the end of it or near the end of it, someone says, can we check in and see where we're at? And if there isn't one for that, be the hero and start it, because then that forces everyone to reflect on where you're at and what's been accomplished, and then it will be very apparent that nothing was done, and then there can be a conversation. That's my suggestion.
There's
And
lots
it's
of
about,
sorry.
sorry, Katie, after you.
I was going to say, I agree with Kristin, and I'm always starting to want to unpick that one, because there's a few things going on for me there. One is, are you being very specific about what the ask is?
Mm-hmm.
Who's taking the actions when you leave the conversation, and are they actually attributable to somebody with a tangible timeline and accountability to it? That might not be the case, so that needs looking at. Yeah, I think that there's a few things there that I want to dig into to find out why. Is it negotiation? So do you need to stop at some point and go, great, it seems we are all agreed that this needs to happen. Who else do we need to get on board? Because is it people outside, for some reason it's not happening. So there's a few things there. I'd want to dig into that a little bit more, because it sounds a fascinating one.
Yeah, and I think, on that point, when I've had to present to boards and senior and chief execs and senior directors, I've been quite clear on the consequences of not having that resource and what it would mean for the organisation if we didn't get that investment. And it's always, and it can be a bit overwhelming sometimes when you're facing into like 20 faces and they're waiting for you to kind of come up with all these solutions. But having a clear, like Katie said, having a clear outcome and what you're agreeing on before you leave that room definitely helps to define what's happening. And even when they say, oh, we'll deal with it afterwards, I think it's about saying, well, just to make it clear, this is the situation, this is what's going to happen, and if these are the outcomes that you want, then sadly this is not going to happen if I don't get the resource of the budget needed to do it. And I think just having that open, transparent conversation at that point and making it quite important, making it sound like it, the importance of it is what will hopefully support you in that conversation.
And they always want to have a conversation about the return on investment, and that's fine. We should always try to look at the return on investment, but we should also have a discussion about the risk of non-investment, which is sometimes a lot easier to measure and show. And so when they say, what is the ROI on this? All right, here's what we think it is. Usually that's enough to convince them, but when it's not, you can then also show, and here's the risk for non-investment. Yeah. So we're going to continue to have accident problems. We're going to continue to have quality problems. We're going to continue to have turnover and all kinds of other negative issues that have huge dollars attached to them. And so not only here's what we will get if we do this, but here's what we will avoid if we stop doing all the negative things that everyone says we need to stop doing.
When we come in and do communication audits and talk to leadership teams and task force, we always end with, here's where you are now, here's where you want to go from a strategic perspective, and here's the steps to get there. And we'll always include a set of quick wins along with long-term investments, because it's important to also think about walking away from that table with one step, one thing that you can do, that you can be successful with, and then you can get to the next one, because success kind of builds on success. You can't sit there and say you're going to be at that lofty goal without taking the small steps that are needed to get there. And that's where, whether I was inside organizations or consulting with organizations, that's where we built our credibility. It's one step at a time.
What's the opposite of imposter syndrome?
Yeah, there is something.
Overconfident.
Fascinating. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And again, a couple of psychologists, and what they found was there are some people, and we will not name names here, on either side of the Atlantic, there are some people who overestimate what they know. So they think they're more expert in certain areas than they are, and they don't realize what they don't know. They're not aware of the unknown unknowns, let's put it that way. So when this first came up, and one of the things that I do as a little game I play with myself is I always think, well, what would the opposite look like? When a client says, our value is integrity, I think, okay, so what would the opposite look like? Would that ever be a thing? No, it wouldn't. So this is probably not strong enough. So what's the opposite of imposter syndrome? And then I thought about the real imposters that I'd met. I haven't met that many, but a lot of them have been on stages, and they've been spouting great thoughts. They thought were great thoughts, but actually they were quite kind of pedestrian, borrowed, shallow views. So that's when I started to think, oh, okay, maybe imposter syndrome is not so bad after all, if it makes you turn up really prepared, having second guessed yourself, done the research, done the hard work. Yeah, that was just anyway, Google it, it's fascinating.
Something I would suggest, since a lot of people, I think myself included, have asked about overcoming it and steps to do that. And I think we've all, mentioned some things, and I think daily practice is a big part of it. But I also think something very practical you could do. It's been very important to me in my career, especially with moving, to build up a network of people in the community, and especially in the internal communication world. The community is such a strong network that I think it would also be a great suggestion, if you have an idea that you are concerned or nervous about taking to leadership, call someone in your network and ask if you can run it by them. I'll speak for myself. I'd be happy to spend 15 minutes and, hear someone's idea, and in a psychologically safe setting, be able to give some feedback and ask some questions. And I imagine that would be a confidence boost, that you would feel more strongly about going into a setting with that information.
I mean, I'm doing free coaching sessions at the moment for exactly that, just because for me, it's fascinating just to hear what people's challenges are. But it's exactly what you've just said, Kristin. It's just the opportunity for someone to say, I'm thinking this. Often, actually, it's people who have just about to start a new job, because there are people starting new jobs in the middle of this pandemic, which is a really tough thing to do. You're going to have two opportunities to join an organisation, one virtually and eventually, hopefully, one in real life. So I completely agree. Find someone that you think, is trustworthy, whose knowledge and experience you rate, to have that conversation with. I think we all need that. Actually, I think we all need it.
Can we expand on this? There's actually a couple of questions from folks that are in that position where they're just starting out and they're already feeling this imposter syndrome, especially given the world being where it is today. I would love to get some thoughts. Maybe Priya, if you wanted to jump in on that.
I think, we talked about coaching and mentoring. Don't be afraid to invest in that as well. I did when I remember, now my dog started barking, of course, but I remember when I started out as a consultant for the first time, having worked for 20 plus years in organizations leading communication. And I thought, oh my God, can I do this? And I had help along the way, to somebody to talk through, who provided that third party opinion, and that could be a friend, it could be somebody, an associate from your professional association, but take advantage of asking for help. I think that's a really important first step.
Yeah, I love that. Particularly if that mentor can give you the courage to be able to say the things that need to be said. I mean, you're all doing your homework and you've got all the data and you're doing all those things. But still, it really comes down to right when that moment happens, you've got to have the courage to say that. One quick story around that. So I was working with the C-suite. They were all concerned that their reviews on Glassdoor were terrible, and people were saying horrible things on the way out the door here about how our leaders and managers weren't treating them the right way. Jason, what can we do to fix that? And of course, the normal solution is, well, we can have all of our happy employees go on there and talk about how great it is. And that's exactly what it'll look like that we did. Or here's a better idea. Why don't we stop treating people like shit? And then everybody just sat there in stunned silence, wondering, who is this guy and how is he thinking he can even talk like this? And the CEO said, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, they need training and they need development and they need to learn empathy and we need to do a whole host of things if we truly want to stop that problem. And he said, all right, great. You're in charge of that. You work with the HR leader, and in 18 months, let's figure out how the progress we've made.
What a novel concept.
A tremendous amount of courage to just blurt that out. And we all thought it. We were all wanted to say it, and nobody said it. And I was like, hell, I'll do it. And so I just said it, and it just made all the difference. It made all the difference. It just took that one little minute of courage, but finally somebody said something transparent and real and honest to a leader who is craving that, and it changed everything.
And the right leaders want that. They want to hear it. I mean, Katie, you have a saying that you talk about. I think you know which one I'm talking about, where you say that you get the organization you deserve, and the organization gets the communicators they deserve.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Also had many CEOs who said, yep, that's what they say to me in the room, but I don't care about that. I want to hear what they're really saying around the water cooler down the corridor, and I don't get to hear that. And we hear this phrase, speaking truth to power, but you're absolutely right. You're thinking it. lots of other people are thinking it too. So it just takes someone to stand up and say it.
And that's a conversation. That's never a presentation. Don't cloak yourself in data and walk in there with that shield on. That's a conversation. Think about the most meaningful conversations you have ever had in your life. None of those were supported by slides. None of them. So go in there armed with the data and then talk about it. Have the conversation. That's what moves people, not a bunch of fancy slides.
Can we also say, at this point in the planetary crisis we're all facing, if this isn't a moment to speak up, to tell the truth, to be open, be honest, to be yourself, then I'm not quite sure when we'll be. So I think we have a moment in our history here to actually do those things. I think you'll be very surprised by how warmly it's welcomed, actually.
Yeah, and you should network. I mean, you're all, 7 years ago, I took the step of volunteering my time to CIPR. I was drowning in imposter syndrome. Sandy was not leaving me alone at that point, and I needed to have a network of people that I could lean on and support. And that network for the last 7 years, as Kristin said, that internal communications community is so strong. And I know, through my social media feeds and to the connections I've met and all these amazing people on this webinar, the support is there. So leaning on them, and before you go into that conference room, to have that conversation with those leaders, touch base with somebody and say, look, this is what I want to say. Does this sound okay? Give me a bit of a boost. I have a tactical tip is I have a playlist on my Spotify of power songs that really kind of get me kind of enthused and energized before I step into that meeting room. Just to give me that. And Amy Cuddy, if you've never checked out Amy Cuddy, she wrote a book around the powerful stance, the super person, superman, superwoman, what you want to call it, stance. And I'm not going to lie, it helps. All these little tips and tricks can really help you boost your kind of confidence before you go into that room. And my network, honestly, I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have those amazing people around me that I could lean on, who were giving me advice and guidance and their expertise throughout my last 7-8 years of me putting myself out there and stepping out of line. So if you are thinking you're on your own and nobody else goes through this and I don't know what to do, then I highly recommend what Kristin said, is reach out to somebody, reach out to any of us. Everyone's really open in the community, and just start that conversation with your peers, and you'll be surprised at what you might discover.
Yeah, if you think about world-class athletes, every single one of them has a coach. Every single one of them. And that's the only way they're able to be world-class, is because they've got somebody there to help them do it.
And to build on the last webinar, I believe that we did, one of the lines that came out of it was, if not you, then who? Mm-hmm. And I think this webinar, now we're adding, if not now, then when?
100%.
That'll be tweeted. So one question that came out during this was, what are the 3 concrete steps? And I made an error in saying there's only 3. It seems like there's more around 5 at least. And so I thought I would just jot down these 5 steps. I'm actually going to edit it before I share it, so everybody that was in this session will get a copy, or everybody that registered will get a copy of this deck, and I'll modify it so it isn't grammatically terrible. But I would love for everybody to just take a minute and say on this panel and say, what is the one thing, if you had one thing you had to do, first step in overcoming the imposter syndrome, what would it be? And I'll start in reverse order with Priya.
Yes.
Just as I'm sure there's like the UPS driver outside, because I don't know if you can hear my dog just going crazy right now. So starting with me. I think it has to start with really believing in yourself and your value. I've spent a lot of time really honoring who I am and what I want and where I want to be, and believing in that. And I think that's really important, that when you're just present and you're not affected by all the stories in your past and looking at other clues outside of you for that reinforcement, and actually looking inside, I think there's a real opportunity there, because I think we're all stronger and have something to contribute.
Katie.
I'm going to reveal something quite personal, because it's something that hasn't been said before. So I have the opposite of what Advita has. So I don't have another Katie who's an imposter, but I do have a Katie who does amazing things that I would never do. And I do speak to her sometimes. And she has done all sorts of things I'd love to do. So if naming your imposter syndrome doesn't quite work for you, then what you might want to try and do is tap into that amazing you that does amazing things that you'd really love to do, and have a conversation with him or her, I think.
I love that. Kristin.
Pay attention to the words that you say to yourself on a regular basis, and listen to those words and write them down. And if those words are not kind words that you would say to someone else, then reframe those phrases in your brain so that you can be kinder to yourself.
Advita.
Don't worry about what other people are thinking in the room. You are an expert in what you're doing. You know, credit yourself for that. You've worked hard to get to where you are. You've deserved that position. So don't give yourself a hard time. And, you know, touching on Kristin's point, be kind to yourself. Talk to you as you would talk to your best friend. Because I think a lot of people forget about that, you know, how they talk to themselves. It's not, you wouldn't talk to your closest friends or your family members who are going through what you may be going through. So be kind to yourself. Don't worry about what's happening, what people may think. Be honest and be true to yourself.
Jason.
I think all of that is fantastic, as are these points here on this slide. And I think my final ad would be part of recognizing that you have imposter syndrome and you're dealing with it helps you also recognize that most of your executives also feel the same way. So now that you know that about yourself and what you need to feel stronger and have more courage, your senior leaders need exactly the same thing. How can you take that self-awareness and project that onto the leaders of the organization who need that as much as anyone else? That puts you in a very unique position, and that's what really makes you a trusted advisor. Not your fancy slides and your fantastic town halls, but the fact that you truly understand the people that you are providing counsel and advice to.
Wonderful. Really quick, I always like to leave people, I don't like to leave people empty-handed. I feel like everyone's brains now is definitely not empty. But if you go to the handout section of the GoToWebinar, you'll see a little PowerPoint slide called Communication Strategy Template. So this is a first step for all of you in this time to say, how am I gonna plan for what's coming? And this is a little tool you can use to take to your leadership, have something concrete. And just to get started, I thought this would be something nice. One of our co-founders, Frank Wolf, put it together. I kind of like it quite a bit, and I wanted to get it over to you guys. This session has been crazy. I loved it. Everything about it was excellent. It far exceeded my expectations. Priya, Katie, Kristin, Advita, Jason, thank you. Thank you for your time. And so if you, just in case any of you didn't see it, you are vastly appreciated throughout this this channel. People are just thanking you for your time, your advice, etc. And I think that there's a lot of folks out there that felt this and were maybe a little afraid to register and didn't want to admit. But it's a reality that a lot of people are living with, and I think you gave us all an incredible amount of advice in order to take it the next step. Yes, the recording will be shared, just in case you still didn't know. Yes, the slides will be shared. Please take advantage. Find Jason, find Advita, find Kristin, find Katie, find Priya on LinkedIn and Twitter, and follow them. They are constantly creating incredible, thoughtful insights and sharing it. So do so, and thank you all. I hope everybody stays as healthy and happy as humanly possible. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
Hi, thank you.
Bye.
We lost him. I think he just left. That's
No,
really
that was
funny.
really good. I really